2026 Consumer Price Index and Inflation, to be presented by the government statistician, Dr. Alassane Idrisu. You are welcome, and we have your full attention, your phones on silent as we go through the estimate. Doc, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francis. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. And thank you for joining us for the release of the Consumer Price Index and Inflation for January 2026. The purpose of this release is simple but very important. We are here to explain how prices are changing across the country, what is driving those changes, and what the numbers mean for households, businesses, policymakers, and the broader economy. As we know, inflation affects everyone. It influences, among others, how much food costs in the market, how much transport we pay, how businesses price their products, and how government plans its budget. That's why the Ghana Statistical Service is committed not only to publishing these numbers, but also to explaining them clearly, honestly, and transparently. But before we look at the numbers, let me briefly explain two key terms that will recur in our presentation today. Year-on-year inflation compares prices in a given month with prices in the same month 1 year earlier. It answers a simple question: how much more or less expensive are goods and services today compared to a year earlier? Month-on-month inflation compares prices in 1 month with prices in the immediately preceding month. It tells us what happened to prices over the most recent month. Both measures are very important when it comes to inflation. Year-on-year inflation shows longer-term trend, while month-on-month inflation helps us understand short-term price movements. Ladies and gentlemen, let's now look at the highlights for the January 2026 CPI and inflation. In January 2026, Ghana's Consumer Price Index stood at 262.3, up from 252.6 in January 2025. This increase in the index translates into a year-on-year inflation rate of 3.8%. In plain language, this means that on the average, prices were 3.8% higher in January 2026 than they were in January 2025. On a month-on-month basis, inflation was 0.2%, meaning prices increased by 0.2% between December 2025 and January 2026. The January 2026 inflation rate of 3.8% is significant for several reasons. First, it is down from the 5.4% recorded in December 2025, representing a 1.6 percentage point decline in 1 month. Second, it marks the 13th consecutive month of decline in inflation. Third, it is the lowest inflation rate recorded since the CPI rebasing in 2021. And finally, when we compare this figure to what occurred the same period last year, which is a year ago, that's January 2025, when inflation stood at 23.5%, we see a 19.7 percentage point reduction in inflation. This sustained decline signals that Ghana is firmly on a path towards price stability. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at inflation by components. Let us now look at food inflation, because food matters most to households, as we all know. In January 2026, year-on-year food inflation was 3.9%, down from 4.9% in December 2025. This tells us that food prices are rising much more slowly than they were a few months ago. On a month-on-month basis, food prices increased by 1.1%, between December 2025 and January 2026. This likely reflects seasonal factors, including post-harvest adjustments, higher demand at the beginning of the year, among others. The key message here, ladies and gentlemen, is that food inflation remains moderate, even though short-term pressures persist. Now let's turn to non-food inflation. The improvement is even more striking when we look at non-food inflation. Non-food inflation declined from 5.8% in December 2025 to 3.9% in January 2026. More importantly, on a month-on-month basis, non-food prices fell by 0.4%. This means that prices of items such as petrol, diesel, baby diapers, gas, and charcoal, which all belong to the category of non-food inflation, actually declined over the month. This decline played a major role in keeping overall inflation low. Now let's look at inflation for goods and then versus inflation for services. So when we split inflation into goods and services, we see further evidence of easing price pressures. Inflation for goods slowed to 3.6% year on year, down from 5.8% in December 2025. Month on month, goods prices largely remained the same between December 2025 and January 2026. This matters because goods account for nearly 3/4 of the CPI basket. So usually when goods inflation slows, most consumers immediately feel the relief directly. This is because it constitutes a very significant proportion of their basket. For services, inflation eased from 4.5% in December 2025 to 4.0% in January 2026, with a 0.3% month-on-month price increase in January 2026 relative to December 2025. Another important dimension is a difference between locally produced items and imported items. Inflation for locally produced items fell from 5.9% in December 2025 to 4.5% in January 2026. Inflation for imported items declined even more sharply from 4.3% to 2.0% over the same period. This possibly reflects improved exchange rate stability, easing global price pressures, and better alignment between domestic and external markets. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's now look at what is happening in the regions. Inflation does not affect all regions equally. In January 2026, the Northeast region recorded the highest year-on-year inflation at 11.2%, up from 9.8% recorded in December 2025, while the Savannah region recorded the lowest at negative 2.6%, down from negative 1.2% in December 2025. Thus, in January 2026, whilst prices reduced by 2.6% year-on-year in Savannah, prices increased by 11.2% year-on-year in Northeast region. On a month-on-month basis, the Northeast region again recorded the highest increase of 2.4%, while the Western region recorded the lowest at negative 1.5%. Thus, between December 2025 and January 2026, prices increased by 2.4% in Northeast, while they reduced by 1.5% in the Western region. These differences point largely to variations in local supply conditions, transport costs, and market access across regions. When we look at contributions, a small number of regions account for large share of overall inflation. The top 5 regional contributors, namely Greater Accra, Ashanti region, Eastern region, Western region, and Volta, together accounted for 82% of the total inflation we recorded in January 2026, while the 5 regions with the highest inflation rates, namely Northeast, Volta, Eastern, Western, Ahafo, accounted for just 41.4% of overall inflation. This tells us that addressing inflation effectively requires region-specific solutions, not one-size-fits-all policies. Now, let's turn to items actually driving inflation. The top 5 contributors to inflation at the item level are charcoal, green plantain, smoked herrings, cinema and cultural services, and ginger. And these 5 items accounted for about 52% of the overall inflation recorded in January 2026. If you extend this to the top 10 contributors, we are talking about the top 10 contributing about 79% to the overall inflation rate of 3.8% in January 2026. The bottom 5 low inflation items, namely garden eggs, which recorded an inflation rate of negative 58.7%, meaning that the price level of garden eggs reduced by 58.7%. Fried plantain, which recorded an inflation rate of negative 50.7%. Cocoyam, inflation rate of negative 58.7%, meaning that the general price level in relation to garden eggs reduced by 58.7% between January 2025 and January 2026. Fried fish, inflation rate of negative 50.7%. Cocoyam leaves or contumely, inflation rate of negative 49.1%. Pawpaw, with inflation rate of negative 46.9%. And fresh tomatoes, with inflation rate of negative 42.5%. Altogether, dragged inflation down by 24%. The top 5 highest inflation items recorded double-digit inflation. These items are ginger, which recorded an inflation rate of 72.3%. Green plantain at 67.9%. Charcoal at 53.7%. Shrimps at 48.8%. And cashew at 47.2%. Together, these items contributed 33.4% to the overall inflation of 3.8%. So this makes, ladies and gentlemen, explain why overall inflation remains low despite increases in selected items. Let's look at the drivers of the January 2026 inflation. Food contributed the most to inflation, despite the drop in food inflation, followed by housing and utilities, clothing and footwear, recreation, sports and culture, and education services. To summarize, the key drivers of inflation in January 2026 from the data are 1, moderate increases in food prices. 2, declining non-food prices. 3, slowing goods inflation. 4, easing imported price pressures. And 5, persistent but localized regional disparities. Together, these factors produce a low and stable inflation outcome in the month of January 2026. Now, what are the key takeaways from the release of the January 2026 CPI and inflation? The data tell a very clear story. Inflation has fallen sharply and consistently over the year. Price pressures are easing across most components of the CPI. While challenges remain, particularly in some regions and food categories, the overall trend is positive. This creates space for planning, confidence, and recovery. In summary, in terms of numbers, we are talking about January 2026 recording an inflation rate of 3.8%. Food inflation at 3.9%. Non-food inflation at 3.9% as well. Goods inflation at 3.6%. Services inflation at 4%. Inflation for locally produced items at 4.5%. And then we have regional differences, which shows that Northeast recorded the highest inflation at 11.2%, and Savannah recorded the lowest at negative 2.6%. Ladies and gentlemen, based on this data, we'd like to make a number of recommendations. For government, it's important to sustain the fiscal discipline, continue efforts to stabilize food prices, and invest in storage, irrigation, transport, and market access to reduce regional disparities. For businesses, easing inflation provides room to invest in efficiency, strengthen local supply chains, reduce unnecessary costs, and translate savings into more stable prices for consumers. For households, this is a good time to plan budget with greater confidence, prioritize essentials, avoid non-essential spending, and save where possible. Before I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express the Ghana Statistical Service's sincere appreciation to those who provided data, the market readers, the media, whose cooperation and professionalism made this work possible. I also want to take this opportunity to commend the hardworking staff of the Ghana Statistical Service, whose dedication ensures that these statistics meet the highest professional standards. Let me also reaffirm the Ghana Statistical Service's commitment to providing timely, accurate, relevant, and credible statistics to support evidence-based decision-making and national development. We remain guided by objectivity, transparency, and independence in everything we do. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Government Statistician, for the presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have received the CPI and inflation figures for January 2026. We want to give you the opportunity to ask questions that might be bothering your mind, or if you need any clarity. This is the time. So if you have any question, please raise your hand so that we'll give you the mic to pose your question, whilst they give you the printouts of the presentation and the infographic. Any question? Or everything was clear?
Clarity begs more questions.
All right.
They need Those people need it. Not you.
Yeah, keep record. All right.
So once you think about your question, the government statistician will give a summary in the local language so that the 3 radio stations can pick it up.
All right. Are you ready for the cheers? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Yo, Anope Yadawana Papa there, why joining at Ghana Statistical Service? You release Nzamabo or Ghana ha, Mensma, Nzamabo ko. On a friend inflation or English. Now, Anope, you release January 2026 inflation. Now, Ning naturally. Yako marketer, yako collect a prices, nzamabo data. Yenhu de January 2026 inflation. Oye means nzamabo kosoro another overform. Inflation at the end of January 2026 about 3.8%. Now if you them 3.8%, yeah, near the compare December 2025. Inflation no ye 5.4%. Young there inflation waba form between December 2025 and January 2026 by 1.6 percentage points. Now if you so now they compare inflation a year ago, that's in January 2025. Them time na inflation year 23.5%. Until you compare young there in January 2026. Inflation will perform by 19.7 percentage points. Now, if you the inflation data here, this is the 13th month. Inflation or perform. Now, the inflation or perform the ma, aya or ye papa ma, or man be a on a friend disinflation process. Now, inflation data na, Jane. Yetimi inflation between 2 successive months. On your friend, month-on-month inflation. And just between December 2025, not January 2026, I'm sorry. Between December 2025, not January 2026, you have the inflation on no year 0.2%. On no, as between December 2025 and January 2026, Nzamabo cost by 0.2%. Now, them inflation of 3.8% year, you recorded for January 2026. You may be said about factors now what cause inflation man about form. Inti Yapade Chechemwa, Yabeshe inflation for Nzama where it's ban items, food items, na Nzama 1 year the banso. Nyasha inflation for Nzama where a deban Nzaman, one inflation bar form to 3.9% in January 2026. You had to compare December, no a 5.8% to bar form. Nyasha inflation for non-food as well. On also bar form to 3.6%. You had to compare December 2025 and not a 5.8%. Now you have services na goods as well. You have there also no inflation about form. Services inflation about form to 4% in January 2026 from 4.5% in December 2025. You have locally produced goods, that's items you produce Ghana ha, also no inflation, also bar form to 4.5% in January 2026. December 2025, no yeah 5.9%, above form to 4.5%. Now yeshe in Zamaswa ya imported the bagana. January 2026, also the inflation bar form to 2%. Yet the compare December 2025 4.3% now. Yehunde inflation for Nzama Yakraba Ghana no oba from papa from 4.3% to 2% compared to other inflation of Bafum. Now your data no so trade even though inflation about form to 3.8%. Yeshishe you compare regions now. Your 16 regions were Ghana ha. Yehunde nye regions ni na we recorded them low inflation. In fact, for Northeast, whilst the national inflation is 3.8%, Northeast recorded 11.2%. But at the same time, for Savannah, the inflation about negative 2.6%. Now, the trading in for Northeast, I recorded inflation of 11.2%. On the trade between January 2026, January 2026 and January 2025. In Zamabu cost or Northeast by 11.2%. Yefa Savannah are recording inflation of negative 2.6%. On the trade Savannah Hono between January 2026 and January 2025, that's a year earlier. Nzama boba foam by 2.6%. In terms of the regions, no different inflation dynamics, no kodo. Based on the January inflation, no, there some recommendations. Now, inflation rate foam, throughout the whole year, or there, you kodo na yema inflation rate foam. Usually, threshold be or inflation about to that level, but overform so too much so also issues. Until there, you watch near my inflation over to tolerable levels. Now, so inflation or there or could not overform, and I maintain them stability. Or there abandon fiscal discipline now. The past 1 year, we're demonstrating or could not demonstrate fiscal discipline. Now, or there abandon so urban home buzzing. Now, baby, or your food producing areas. Yama with him create environment that want him produce food near papa. Now about to invest in storage, irrigation, transport, na market assets so that food no so your producer, your team a transport from the production centers to the marketing centers. Now America food assembly because food ne proportion where inflation basket no so. Now obi aso didi. Nti usually the policies not to affect food year aya or inflation papa. But businesses, so yereka there, since inflation aba for me, or their businesses, what to take advantage, no they invest, no expand, now what to produce more efficiently. Now, one strength in local supply chains, so now, so unnecessary costs be or aya or in care, one yana, one reduce them costs then. Now savings be so bad in the cost of production of their goods and services, aya one translate. And I want to transfer some of the savings to consumers. Household, I mean now, the inflation figures also share. Inflation is year, for the past 13 months. And the inflation is from them now, or provide stability. Aya oyema households. And this is the best time order you plan yen sikasem ye. Now, you make sure that in some way essential and you prioritize. Na monye important to life musi yada kuichiri kakra. But this is the best time say savings be or there yeah. This is the best time to save. CCR inflation over for me. Inti ladies and gentlemen, yada wana se papa there. Waba will be take Ghana Statistical Service. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now you can ask your questions. Unless you are okay, then we'll thank you again. Okay, Echo has his hand up, so please.
All right, Doc, thank you for the elaboration
Yeah.
and the tree version. Two things. To what extent do you think seasonality played a role in here? Given that in December, many Ghanaian in diaspora will come home, come and spend some FX, come and spend time holidaying around. Then they check out by the latest second week of January. So it's because they're also bringing a lot of foreign exchange. That strengthens the currency even further.
Yeah.
And then a few other things like you mentioned cinemas and what have you,
Yeah.
and also get together or patronage.
Right.
So to what extent does this affect the rate we are seeing in January? And also, given the trend we are on, it looks like we could bottom out at a deflation. To what extent is that a risk? Then finally, you also mentioned threshold. From where you sit, the data you have, the intricacies of it all, which inflationary figure or range would you consider being maybe optimal given our economic situation and from whence you've come and where we are headed? Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. This is Econs 101 questions. So there's another question at the back there.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes.
Doc,
Yes.
I thank you for your delivering style, especially the recommendation component
Okay.
of the data. I wish to know, when you go to Bank of Ghana, the governor will always project and say that his personal vision is to ensure that the policy rate is continuing to come down or the downstream. And I know you as GSS, we don't project, but what's your expectation, especially when you are starting on good note for this year? So fully we can say that we take off fully by January. What's your expectation in terms of inflation? And then do you get feedback from your recommendations, especially from the government? Yeah, your recommendations are good. Do you get feedback from businesses, individual, a government especially, because your recommendations affect their policies? So do you get any feedback from them?
Okay.
Good morning, Francis Gianni. Doc, I would want to follow up on the recommendations. Is the service doing any tracking to know what the government in particular is doing with respect to the various recommendations that you give? Because, for instance, we've been seeing the transport sector and the challenges. So if you are doing some tracking, we'll be able to know where the government needs to prioritize. If you are doing that, if you could give us some updates on that. If you are not doing so, what do you intend doing about it? Thank you.
Okay. All right. Great.
I think, Doc, we can please
We
go
can.
ahead and
Okay.
respond to this.
So first question. Your first question is about seasonality and whether people moving in and bringing in FX and moving out with carrying, with those excess, FX, not coming in again. To what extent does it impact inflation? So let me answer it from this angle. The inflation figures we report at the Ghana Statistical Service is driven by a number of considerations or factors. And I must say that if we want to categorize these considerations, then we can categorize them into one, macroeconomic management and performance. That's one. We can categorize them into real sector improvement or otherwise. That's two. We can also look at what is happening from the global front. And then sometimes we can look at base effect, because sometimes base effect can also influence the disinflation process. So if you take the macroeconomic management, that's where the exchange rate, your question about exchange rate comes in. So all other things being equal, the exchange rate movements, as we know, affect the price movement as well. And this is because some of the items we consume in the country, as we said, are what? Imported from outside. And once they're imported from outside into the country, it means that the exchange rates would affect their prices. So in that, from that perspective, if you have the cedi depreciating or losing value, it means that you need more cedis to do what? To buy the items you are bringing from outside to the country. And all other things being equal, that would translate into higher prices for the items in your country. Now, for the past 1 year, we've seen some stability when it comes to the exchange rate movements. In fact, we've even recorded appreciation. At the end of December, I think the cedi appreciated by, 40.7%, if my memory serves me right. And so if you look at 2025, we've seen some, appreciable level of appreciation of the cedi. So what that means is that if you imported goods and services into the country, you were relatively paying less cedis compared to previously. So that bodes well for prices. Even for items which we produce locally, some of them, we have to source their input or their raw materials from outside. And so once they come from outside, they affect inflation. Now, if you have people coming, visiting Ghana in December from outside, definitely, yes, I agree with you, they'll bring in some effects. But the question is quantum. So at the end of the day, what is the quantum or the volume of effects such people bring in? I mean, given the sources of effects that come into the country. But the good news is that all of these translate into that one single indicator, which is what we call depreciation or appreciation of the cedi. So they all feed into it. But I agree with you, if the quantum is big, and then it comes in December, and all of a sudden it's not coming in, then there may be a problem in the following month in terms of the prices, because then the cedi may suffer some depreciation or reduction in appreciation. Now, just to extend it a bit, we've seen that in recent times, I think the past year-to-date movement of the cedi, we've seen that it's been depreciated by about 4.6 or 7%. So that's depreciation for the first 1 month of the year or so. So what that means is that if the depreciation continues in the same way I explained, it's likely to impact on goods that are imported into the country, or goods even produced in the country whose raw materials are sourced from what? From outside. So that's how I'd like to answer the question. Second question, which inflationary figure or region would you consider optimal? That's the question? Yeah. All right, so that's a good question. So like I keep saying all the time, the Ghana Statistical Service is not in the business of either projecting inflation or determining the optimal level of inflation. We don't have any problem if we are invited by the authorities that are clothed to do this work to take part in the process, because we provide the data. So we don't have a problem if we have to do that. But I think my simple answer to you is that we are not the authority responsible for that. And so I will not be able to formally tell you what the optimal inflation rate is. I think the Bank of Ghana and the Ministry of Finance are better placed. But having said that, I must also add that, in fact, our researchers in the tertiary institutions, that's part of their responsibilities. I mean, they can do their independent, assessment of what the optimal rates of inflation is, and then the media can take the figure. But then once you take those figures that come from the academia, you have to interpret it as such, knowing that the body that's actually clothed with the mandate to do those analyses and pronounce on them officially would be the Bank of Ghana, working together with the Ministry of Finance. So that's how I'd like to take that question. Then there was a question with regards to policy rate. You said policy rate is coming down?
No, I'm
Yes.
BOG boss,
Yes.
you know, make the point that
Yeah.
his personal view
Yes.
opinion is that we want the policy rate to remain or should come down.
Okay.
Instead of, you know, should be down, further. That's his perspective. I'm also asking you if, for instance, I will have personal projection.
Personal projection. I just answered your question. Yes, I just answered your question. That yes.
I don't know how to answer it.
Okay.
I'm saying that has government ever given you feedback?
Yes, 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 yes. Okay, so that's a good question. Again, I think this question keeps coming, so it's not the first time we are getting the question, but it's a very good question. I mean, I'll answer it this way. So since April or May last year, if you check, we introduced this recommendation as part of our dissemination process. We used not to do that, but we did that for a number of reasons. The main reason being that though we are data producers, but the end goal is not just to produce the data for production's sake, no. The end goal is to produce the data for the data to be used. And get the catch word there is what? Used. For the data to be used to make informed decision, so that that informed decision can eventually bode well for national development. That's the purpose. So for the Ghana Statistical Service, we don't end at just producing the data and disseminating it. No. If we ended there, we would have failed in our mandate. So we are in the data value chain, from the production to the processing to the dissemination, even down there to outcomes, development outcomes, to impact and development outcomes. So you see us in all the value chain of data. So if that is the case, if we do nice analysis, we come out with the findings. We think that because we collected the data and we come with the findings, it will be important to contribute to the exercise of nation building, national development by proposing some recommendations. So we've started giving recommendations. And it is heartwarming that since we started that, we've had a number of positive feedback, not only from government. We've had positive feedback from government, from other stakeholders, including private sector, and even some individuals. Now, to answer your question directly, yes, we've had positive feedback from government. On inflation, specifically, if you check the 2026 budget, we had engaged much earlier before the 2026 budget. It wasn't surprising to us at all that most of the proposals that were put in the budget sent to Parliament for approval, which became part of the 2026 budget, were actually responding to some of the recommendations we had made in the past. And so if you look at agriculture sector, for example, there were very specific intervention in agriculture, in food, and all that. And then I must also say that because of our engagement, the Ministry of Finance actually recognized, or let me say, prioritized data production and dissemination. And so if you check the 2026 budget, you see that statistical service and data production and dissemination and use has actually been prioritized. So it is all coming out of the engagement that we've been having with key stakeholders, including government, on the work, not only the CPI, on the work that we do in general, but also the CPI. So I think, yes, we get positive feedback, and we wish to get some more from all manner of stakeholders so that we can use that to improve the work that we do. And then, sorry? On the same. Okay, so it looks like I've answered the, yeah.
Risk of deflation.
Risk of deflation, yes, yes, yes. Yes.
So I want a clarification
Yes.
on whether or not
Yeah.
the service is doing a tracking of the various recommendations. So for instance, now that you are seeing some kind of this in the transport sector, if some recommendations are gone and you are tracking the progress, we need to know that this is what the government is doing, this is how far we've gone, these
Yes.
are the things that we
Yeah.
need to
So
do.
we track, like I said, we track, and the answer I gave is just an example of the tracking. Like I said, we gave a number of recommendations. We still talk to the authorities and key stakeholders, and then we're able to tell whether recommendations are being implemented or not. So we do the tracking, yes. And then there was a question on deflation. Yes, I talked about thresholds. Yes, at the trend. Yes.
Leading to deflation, what is the risk?
Is it leading to deflation? The first part of that question we can't answer because, like I keep saying, we are not in the business of forecasting. So we cannot say that inflation today is 3.8%, and then next month is we project that. No, we don't do that. Again, we can speak to the Bank of Ghana or the Ministry of Finance, and even the academia. They do these forecasts. So I think we can speak to them and get the response. But I think that second leg of your question, which is, there's a reason why there's a threshold. And you see, every economy, whether it is Ghana or any other country in a developing country, or even the advanced countries, they have some macroeconomic objectives they have to pursue and achieve. One is price stability. Every government, whether it's US, it's Ghana, price stability. And I'll come back to the price stability because your question relates to that. But it's not only price stability. You have to make sure that you achieve balance of payment, stability as well. It's also very, very important. You have to make sure that you distribute resources equitable. So equitable distribution of resources is also very, very important. And then you have to make sure that you provide employment, decent jobs for your people. It's also very important. And growth is also very important. So these are the broad key macroeconomic objectives every country tries to achieve. But you see, now, a number of these objectives, as you are trying to achieve all of them, some of them are conflicting. They conflict. So, and that's where economic management comes in. That's why you should have a manager, somebody who has a skill to manage these in a manner that even if there are conflicts, the conflicts are minimized so that ultimately you achieve your objectives. Now let's come to prices. So prices, yes, there are players in the market, basically two players. You have those who are buying and those who are selling. So you have to be mindful that it's not just about those who are buying or the consumers. It's also about those who are selling or the producers. It's very, very important. Like we learned in school, Econ 101, like my brother said, all other things being equal, the higher the price, the lower the demand. All other things being equal, the higher the price, the higher the supply, right? So that's the theory behind demand and supply. Catchword, all other things being equal. If you bring the two players together, that's when they say you determine what the equilibrium price. For me and you who are the consumers, if you study consumer behavior, our utility or satisfaction is maximized when prices are they are lowest. Because we work, we earn income, we want to buy goods at prices that are as low as possible. So that's a rational behavior, right? But remember that the goods must be produced by somebody. That person must be in business. Otherwise, you can consume the good today. Tomorrow, the goods will not be available for you. So, and that person is the producer or the supplier. And for that person, the higher the price, the better it is for that person, right? So you have to come to a situation where the prices that you pay for the item is okay for the consumer. At the same time, it's okay for the producer. That's where you have the optimal threshold of inflation coming in. But it's not even for the producer and consumer alone, no. In fact, the ultimate threshold thing comes in because there is a level of prices. If you go beyond it, it may hurt your macro stability. If you go below it, it hurts your macro stability. So it goes beyond even individuals, but it's important for the general economy. So if if inflation is coming down, I said the last time, I'm going to repeat it. Every positive inflation, whether it is 0.1, no matter how small it is, it means prices have increased. So let's take note of that. Prices have gone up. Any positive inflation means that prices have gone up. But it's just a matter of degree. So like January 2025, we said inflation was 23.5%. January 2020, just a year earlier. In January 2026, we said inflation is 3.8%. Both of them, prices went up. But the rate in January 2025 was way higher, 23.5%. And the rate in January 2026 is what? Lower, 3.8%. But in each case, prices have what? Gone up. So I think it's important to note that positive inflation means what? Price increases. So disinflation means that you still have a positive inflation, but that inflation is doing what? It's coming down, slowing down. So if you have inflation from 23.5% in January 2026, right, and then it comes down to 3.8% in January 2026, that's a disinflation process. And that's good. But the question is, at what level of inflation is the economy able to accommodate, which is good for even the individuals, we consumers, and then what? The producers. That threshold is what you're asking me, and I'm not able to tell you because it's not my job to do so. So let's relate to the academia and to Ministry of Finance and to Bank of Ghana for that threshold. But we need that threshold because we have to be mindful that the inflation dynamics or movements, right, it does not unduly affect some of the players in the market, particularly producers. Now, if you come back home to Ghana, you recall quite recently that producers of some food items, faced some glut, and so the prices of those food items actually what? Reduced considerably. And here I'm not even talking about small inflation. I'm talking about negative what? Inflation, meaning that the price of those food items reduced. And if you're into a production of such goods, it is not good because if you're not careful, yes, for consumers, you and I, prices lower, it's okay for us. But those people must continue to produce the tomatoes. They must continue to produce those food items. That's why it's important to watch inflation so that the managers of the economy will manage the economy in a way that, yes, inflation can come down. But the most important thing is what? Stability. And stability means that you should drive inflation down to tolerable levels and maintain it around there so that it provides the certainty that's required for people to plan, for the business people to plan, individuals to plan, etc., etc. So that's how I'll answer that question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Lassa, thank you, Deputy Government Statistician. Thank you, our colleagues from Bank of Ghana. Thank you, the media, for... You have another question? A comment.
Doc.
Yes.
Once upon a time, we were supposed to have had a get-together that was slated for December 7th.
Oh, it's not once upon a time yet.
The January 7th
it's in the pipeline.
Has looked.
Oh, we didn't mention January 7th.
Did, and I said that was Muhammad's coronation and that will undermine what we are doing. And it's not happened.
Because of the holiday. But you hear from us,
the media thing will come on.
But you are sounding very political. It's in the pipeline. It's in the pipeline.
So we programmed it for first quarter
Okay.
of 2026. So hopefully by end of March, we would have done it. So we'll let you know.
All right. Thank you.
So we don't want it to be once upon a time.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, by the way, the deflation question, I think you asked, let me come there and then say that, yes, I explained. But also, you see, when you face deflation, especially serious ones, just like hyperinflation, the opposite is deflation. You are likely, if you're not careful, it can affect your employment situation. So that's another thing you should look at. And also, when you face very severe deflation, if you're not careful, like I said, to affect production, it will affect businesses, and it can affect even the revenue that the government is getting from those businesses. So you have to be mindful of all of these. And that's why you need to manage the economy in a way that, yes, you may be having stable prices, but those prices must be tolerable, must be at tolerable levels. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So expect more of these tutorials when we get together by the end of the quarter. Right. So thank you. We hope to see you again at our next release. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you.